All right, welcome to class, everyone. Go ahead and find your seats. Today's clinical explainer is, well, it's going to challenge basically everything you think you know about modern medicine. We're diving into a real-world case study, and I really want you all to put your diagnostic hats on for this one. We're looking at a highly trained nurse practitioner. She was fit, she ran marathons, she taught group fitness classes for literally decades, and she maintained an exceptionally healthy lifestyle. Zero chronic medical problems. But then, she got sick. And the absolute kicker? The very medical system she worked inside, the system she deeply, fundamentally trusted, it completely failed her.
So, let me just throw a question out to the class right up front. Think about your future clinical practice. What actually happens when the lab says your patient is completely fine, but their body, their actual lived experience is screaming otherwise? This right here is a dangerous clinical trap, and honestly, it is so incredibly easy to fall into. We are trained to trust the data, right? But what happens when the data is entirely blind to the disease?
Well, to answer that, here is our syllabus for today's explainer. We'll be starting with the diagnostic trap, then we'll walk through her 10-year mystery case, explore the illusion of normal, learn why we absolutely must prioritize patterns over isolated values, and finally, uncover the massive environmental blind spot that cost this patient a decade of her life.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the diagnostic trap.
Look, there is this incredibly dangerous illusion floating around in medicine today. It's this blind belief that modern lab diagnostics will just automatically identify and explain any chronic disease. Even our patient, who was a super experienced medical insider herself, fell for this. She just assumed that if she developed a serious illness, the right test would pop up with a giant red flag and tell her exactly what was wrong. But as future clinicians, you have got to realize that diagnostics are just tools. They are not magic crystal balls.
And that brings us to Section 2, a 10-year mystery case.
Let's look at how illness actually begins in the real world. It's almost never just one single isolated event. It's a perfect storm. Look at her timeline right here in 2012. Over a really short window, she delivered her son by C-section. She got a tick bite that resulted in a Lyme disease diagnosis, and, on top of all that, she started working overnight as the nursing supervisor at a pediatric ventilator facility. Now, at the time, these seem totally unrelated, but clinically speaking, these are three massive, overlapping physiologic stressors just hammering her immune system all at once.
And over the next few months, her symptoms just started cascading. First, it was profound fatigue. I'm not talking about just being tired, I mean the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that a good night's sleep doesn't even touch. Next came this constant, heavy sensation of pressure right behind her eyes. She described waking up feeling like her brain was literally inflamed. Then the brain fog rolled in. Imagine being a high-level healthcare provider and suddenly losing confidence in your own cognitive function, literally struggling to recall basic everyday words. And it didn't stop there. Her musculoskeletal system joined the party with this weird, migrating pain. Shoulders one week, knees the next. And it was tendon pain, which was actually worse than joint pain. Some days she couldn't even grip her coffee mug. Finally, food she had eaten her entire life safely started triggering severe bloating, flushing, and these intense mast cell-type reactions.
So, like any logical, health-literate patient, she sought answers. She stepped on to what I like to call the exhausting medical carousel. She went to neurology, rheumatology, dermatology, GI, infectious disease, the whole 9 yards. But here's the problem. Everyone just looked at her through the super narrow lens of their own specific specialty. Everyone ordered another basic lab panel. Everyone generated another standard differential diagnosis. But absolutely no one could explain why her physical health was completely falling apart. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, the illusion of normal. Take a look at the jarring disconnect here. You basically have two completely different realities trying to exist at the exact same time. The laboratory story, oh, it was beautifully reassuring. Her inflammatory markers were totally normal. Autoimmune testing, completely unremarkable. But then you contrast that pristine paperwork with the patient's actual story, waking up with morning brain inflammation, debilitating migrating tendon pain, and profound exhaustion where she couldn't even recover from a light jog. This is the real danger of the lab sheet, guys. It can so easily mask the messy, painful reality of your patient's actual daily suffering.
And this brings us to Section 4, patterns over isolated values. I really need you to tune in here because this is the absolute pivot point of today's lecture.
Let's look at how we actually build a clinical picture over time. When we look back at a decade, 10 full years of her routine blood work, we do see subtle abnormalities. They were there. Her complete blood counts showed intermittent leukopenia,
and chronically low monocytes. She had persistent macrocytosis, even though her nutrition was fantastic. Her alkaline phosphatase was always hovering at the absolute low end of normal, and her fasting glucose just kept drifting upward, despite an excellent diet and tons of exercise.
But guess what? Every single one of those findings was dismissed. Why? Well, because individually, none of them definitively established a diagnosis. Not a single one of them triggered that giant, flashing red flag the specialists were waiting for. But if you take 10 years of these drifting trends, they paint a crystal-clear picture of chronic immune dysregulation. It just required someone to step back and look at the whole canvas, rather than staring unblinkingly at a single pixel.
So, the absolutely crucial point is this. If you write only one thing down in your notes today, make it this. Patients do not become ill one laboratory value at a time. Seriously, let that sink in. You are in training to treat human beings, not isolated data points. You cannot practice good medicine by simply sitting around waiting for a number to turn red on a computer screen.
A true diagnosis requires so much more than a quick blood draw. It requires analyzing long-term patterns across multiple panels. It requires understanding the actual context of your patient's life. It requires thoroughly reviewing their history, and above all else, validating their lived experience. If the patient tells you they are sick and the lab says they are well, you keep investigating the patient.
Finally, let's move to Section 5, the environmental blind spot.
For 10 whole years, brilliant, well-meaning physicians failed this nurse practitioner. And it wasn't because they lacked compassion or because they weren't smart. It was because they were asking the entirely wrong questions. They were relentlessly searching for diseases that simply did not exist in her body. They hunted for autoimmune diseases, they looked for weird neurologic conditions, endocrine disorders, persistent infections.
But do you know what no one asked? Literally not one provider asked about her physical work environment. No one asked if the pediatric facility where she spent 12 hours every single night had ever experienced water damage. No one thought to ask if her symptoms magically improved when she went on vacation and got away from that building. Well, it turns out that facility had extensive, completely hidden water damage. And just to put that into perspective, that's a factor estimated to affect up to half of all commercial buildings. And for her, it was serving as a massive, invisible source of chronic physiologic stress.
10. That is the number of years lost. A full decade of a vibrant woman's life was just stolen by this diagnostic odyssey, all because no one in the medical system thought to just look at the air she was breathing and the environment she was working in. That is a heavy, heavy cost for a clinical omission. And that right there is exactly why we must evolve how we practice clinical medicine. Alongside the traditional medical history you're all learning, you have got to learn to take a detailed environmental history. This is a crucial, necessary clinical assessment of a patient's buildings, their workplaces, and the hidden physical stressors they interact with every single day. The environment is the invisible factor in chronic disease. As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a real challenge for your future clinical rounds. Will you look beyond the lab sheet? Will you stop just treating isolated numbers, start hunting for those longitudinal patterns, and actually ask your patients about their environment tomorrow? Because the next chapter of this mystery, it wasn't solved in a laboratory. It was solved by inspecting a building. And I truly hope you take that lesson with you into every single exam room. All right, class dismissed. I'll see you all next time.